broader stage now, which is, of course, the globe and what's happening in it. You will recall that our first few esteemed speakers from this morning already put into place the realities of India-US relations, India-China relationship, and leadership globally when it comes to a fragmented world as we're seeing it today. We bring all these three views together on one stage now. This is going to be a riveting chat on making sense of all the chaos we see around us. Please put your hands together once again as I welcome to the stage John Mearsheimer, R. Wendell Harrison, Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science, University of Chicago. Welcome back, Professor. Put your hands together for Yan Jiotong, Distinguished Professor and Dean of Institute of International Relations. Welcome back, sir. And we also would warmly like to invite back Monica Duffy Toft, Professor of International Politics and Director of Center for Strategic Studies, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Can I also request Dr. Shashi Tharoor to kindly join us on the stage and lead this conversation in a way only he can. I think we can show some more energy for our brilliant speakers, and this will be a fantastic session, one can already tell.
Hello everyone, do take your seats. It's marvelous to have you all back. I think those of you who were here this morning have already had the benefit of hearing a terrific amount of wisdom from all three of them in their individual conversations. Now we have a chance to hear them together on what's been dubbed the New World Order, which I think really is the New World Disorder. And I think it might be appropriate to perhaps start off in the same order in which we heard them this morning. So I'll turn to Professor Mearsheimer. He had set the tone for us first thing in the morning today. And I think while we focused principally on Indo-US relations then, I'm going to ask him to broaden his lens and ask him to tell us where he sees the world heading. I've written a piece, some of you may have seen, in one of our leading newspapers about 10 days ago, arguing that my worry is not just that that might seems to have replaced right in world affairs, and that the sanctified principles of the UN Charter, state sovereignty, the inviolability of borders, the inadmissibility of the use of force in settling international affairs, all of those things have simply been cast by the wayside. Now governments are simply asserting their powers, and it's a simple issue now of the only thing holding nations back from attacking each other is no longer any scruples about international law, but rather quite simply whether they can get away with it, whether the target of their attacks might be able to raise the price for them to pay and not. And in those circumstances, have we reached a world, Professor Mearsheimer, where the only rule around is that there are no rules at all?
I think that when you think about the world moving forward, the three most important areas of the world to focus on are Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East. And I think that if you look at all three of those areas today, you see huge potential for trouble. In fact, East Asia is the most peaceful of those three areas at the moment. And Europe and the Middle East are the most dangerous, and in fact you have ongoing conflicts in those two regions. I think the situation is only going to get worse with time. And let me say a few words about this, starting with Europe. It's very important to understand that at some point the Ukraine war is going to end. But when it ends, you're going to have poisonous relations between Russia on one side and Ukraine and Europe and the United States on the other side. You're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement. The best you can hope for is an armistice that will lead to a frozen conflict. And the potential for that war reheating will be very great. And furthermore, you'll have poisonous relations, as I said, between Russia on one side, the Europeans, the Ukrainians, and the Americans on the other. Superimposed on the Russia-Ukraine conflict will be 6 different flashpoints where war could break out. The Arctic, the Baltic Sea, Belarus, Kaliningrad, Moldova, and the Black Sea. So Europe is going to be the scene of much potential trouble moving forward. Then there's the Middle East. We're all wondering whether the United States and Israel are going to attack Iran or not. Whether the United States and Israel go to war against Iran doesn't mean that this is going to be settled once and for all. For as far as the eye can see, you're going to have trouble in the Middle East, and the United States is going to be in the middle of it. The principal reason for that is Israel is a highly aggressive state. It's deeply committed to reordering the Middle East at the end of a rifle barrel. And you all know, the United States and Israel are joined at the hip. Those 2 areas, for sure, you can anticipate big trouble moving forward. And then there's East Asia, which at the moment is the most peaceful region of the world. But you have 3 big flashpoints: East China Sea, South China Sea, and Taiwan. It is not likely, but it is possible that you could have a war breakout between the United States on one side, allied with countries like Japan and Australia, against China over a place like Taiwan or the South China Sea. Let's hope that doesn't happen. But all of this is to say, when you look at the 3 main areas of the world where the great powers are involved, you see trouble now in 2 of those 3 areas, big trouble, and the potential for continued trouble in all 3 of those areas moving forward.
Well, that is a rather pessimistic view of the world. Professor Yan Shui-Tong, if we were to look at this larger question I asked about a world without rules, we've already had Prime Minister Carney, who's in Mumbai today, make a speech in Davos, where he said essentially that all the old verities were hypocrisies, and essentially now we're living, as it were, not quite in a post-truth world, but in a post-international rule or international law world. Now, in this, interestingly enough, your president, Xi Jinping, has been a staunch voice for multilateralism. He's talked about China's faith in upholding the world order, and China has indeed been active in many of the institutions of the global system that the US now seems to be either withdrawing from or wrecking from within, as in the WTO. Where do you see the evolution of the multilateral system, and where do you see China playing its role in this larger question of world order?
Well, nowadays when people are talking about the global order, and they said the rule-based order is over. Now we move into the chaos without rules. Actually, that's not the reality. Rules are there. And the question is whether people follow the rules or not. And when we have the so-called rule-based order during the post-Cold War period, it's the United States follow the rules established by itself. Today, the problem, and Trump administration disrupting the order by not respect the rules established by the United States. I think that's the difference. Second, whether we can establish new rules and based on any global leadership, this morning I said that that's impossible. There's no leadership. No, I mean, no country can offer a unilateral leadership for establish global new rules. And so we have 2 kinds of orders in human being. One is a leader-based order. The other is an order without leadership, or we can call it this a leaderless order. So you find that if you look at the situation in the Pacific, these island states, there's no leadership. They still can maintain the good relationship. What's that kind of leader? That leader follows 2 principles. Everyone follows neighbors, but keep distance from neighbors. In terms of politics, that means that everyone follows the principle of peaceful coexistence, and then they can maintain the order. Now come to your question, and what kind of new orders we are going to have. Chinese government advocated to establish new rules based on multilateral cooperation. That means the new rules is not set up or established by one country, by one leadership, but by joint leadership or joint efforts through multilateral diplomacy.
Interesting. Well, Professor Monica Duffy Toft, you heard Professor Mearsheimer saying this morning, and I think implicitly repeating today, that strategic competition between the US and China will tend to define a lot of what awaits the world. I don't know, first of all, whether you would agree with that proposition, and if so, how do you see the China that Professor Yan has just described? Are we talking about a China that remains and evolves itself as the principal revisionist power challenging US primacy in the world? Or do you see China upholding a world order that the US is today challenging? How do you see the shape of global world order in the context of this strategic rivalry?
So it's a great series of questions, and what I would say is, John Mearsheimer is going to hate this, it's complicated. Because the first thing I would say is, it's not just about the US and China. There are only two countries in the world. Yes, they're the biggest on the block, but you still have the Russian Federation, you have the BRICS, which the BRICS are now 12 countries. So when you talk about multilateralism, in some ways, yes, multilateralism is dead. But in other ways, you're seeing countries sort of realign or align for the first time to sort of counterbalance what they see as the strategic competition between. It's already there. And I would say the strategic competition, not necessarily 2017, which we heard this morning, but actually 2008, because that was when we had the financial crisis in the West. And what did the Chinese learn? Oh, we don't want to go there. We saw what happened with the Soviet Union on the political, ideological side. Now we're seeing what's happening in the Western systems on the economic side. And so we lost a lot of respect there in the Chinese polity, right, on our economics. And then the Russian Federation, it was in 2000, 2008, they were done with Chechnya. They pulled back. They won their war on terror. They're also watching the West. And Putin had been telling, and Professor Mearsheimer is very clear about this, wagging his finger and say, please don't expand east, please don't expand east, please. And so 2007, 2008 was a really remarkable point. And I would say that's when we really started the strategic competition. We already had it with the Russian Federation, but Putin really gave up and said, okay, we're done with the West. And then with China, they saw the writing on the wall and they thought that the Western system. So the strategic competition's been going on a while. I think what's different now in the last 5 years, and in particular with the Trump administration coming in, is that other states are now realizing that that competition's real, and they have to make a choice. Because they're going to be compelled to make a choice, because in the global system, you've got to ally. So we either bandwagon, right, with the power that's going to sort of do your bidding, or you're going to balance against a power. And I think that's what we're seeing. So two things. One is the strategic competition is here. And second, other states have the capacity, and they do if they ally properly in some ways, to sort of try to counterbalance this strategic competition that's happening between China and the US. And we heard that in this panel right before about what the countries of South Asia are trying to do, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. They also have room for maneuver here. And Europe, we could talk about Europe. If Europe could get its house together, that is a big if, we know that, it could strategically balance Russia. It now has the strong, in its pocket, it's got the strongest military in Europe in Ukraine. It's well trained now, Poland's training up. The question is do they have the wherewithal to be able to do it?
Fascinating. Now, let's take the second round in the opposite direction, begin with you and come this way. What you're saying suggests that you see this as a definitively multipolar world, whereas many others have been arguing that it's not yet clear that true multipolarity will emerge when there are these two behemoths, at least one existing behemoth still flailing about and the other one rising to acquire comparable dimensions. Will that give us enough room to truly develop cogent alternative poles of influence? What you're suggesting seems to me that we're already there. Is that what you're saying? Is this a multipolar world?
You know, it's a great question. And what I would say is I'm not sure we're fully there yet. The thing is, we have to recognize that Russia does have a nuclear arsenal, and Putin's made it very clear that he's comfortable with the use of force. That is the only reason why, by the way, he's still considered a great power, in addition to the landmass. I mean, Eurasia is huge. And then we've got China. I think you can now say, at least economically, it's a global power. Technologically, it's probably a global power. Militarily, it's not. It's still a regional power. The United States is global across the board. So I think if you look at the Russian Federation, you look at the United States, and you look at China, we are already in a multipolar world. There is strategic competition across those three states. The question is what Europe does. Where does India fall into this? And then in South America, where does Brazil? Brazil is a huge country. Another country two countries we don't talk about is Indonesia and Nigeria. Nigeria and Indonesia are going to have really big populations in about two generations, while Western Europe and the United States decline in terms of population. Oh, and by the way, same thing with China. Right? China no longer has this one-child policy any longer because it's worried about its dependency ratios. It doesn't have the workers to support their economy. So I think it's still up in the air as to whether we go to multipolar. I think we are in a tripolar at this point. An exception might be that Russia and China are pretty cozy. So if you look at that alliance, that's very interesting, that tightness between China and Russia. Because if you count that, maybe we're in a bipolar. So
well, that's exactly where I was going to go with Professor Yan, but I must make a small aside about demography. China is losing population, but it's incredibly speeding up the manufacture of robots to do the kinds of things that workers used to be able to do. So I'm not quite sure that our old-fashioned focus on demography won't be overtaken by robotics, but maybe that's a different direction.
The other thing about demography, which I really want to put on the table, is 70 really is the new 40. And so we haven't, as human species, adapted to the idea that a 70-year-old can perform as well as a 40-year-old. You can. I've been told after 70, it's all downhill. But at least we do know that in health terms, and we haven't taken that into account yet, that we're aging better.
That's right. And you know, I ran into Professor Joseph Stiglitz this summer, and he'd just come from visiting a BYD factory, I think, in China, where he said they were producing 2,000 cars a day or something with just 8 people, and not one of them was actually involved in producing the car. They were only supervising the robots. So that is perhaps where us being complacent about demography may lead us. But Professor Yan, I really wanted to go back to Professor Duffy Toft's earlier point, which is, how close are China and Russia? And if indeed there is an emerging bipolar competition between the US and China, where does Russia fit into your worldview, into China's worldview? And if, on the other hand, it's still an emerging multipolarity with Russia credibly still a major nuclear power willing to use force, as she said, Europe perhaps beginning to assert itself now that it realizes it can't just stay in America's shadow, and India perhaps also growing and determined to assert itself as a singular pole. So we really are heading to a multipolar world. Then what becomes of the Russia-China closeness? How do you see this evolving, this particular dynamic?
First, I have to admit that all governments, no matter big power, small power, all advocate for multipolarization. But when we use the term multipolar, from my understanding, we should discover several poles that are relatively equal. If not exactly the same, but then you cannot have a big gap between them. If you take it in the issue domain, and you consider in that specific issue, and you have at least 3 poles are relatively equal. Nowadays, I doubt I can find any relatively equal poles in the world more than 3. So I know politically correct, we have to talking about multipolarization, but actually I cannot see that. Second, it's about the people. There's a confusion usage of multipolarization and multilateralism. Multilateralism means more than 3 countries work together, cooperating with each other. That's a kind of a diplomacy. It has nothing to do with the power structure. Multipolar refers to power structure rather than diplomatic relationship or the diplomacy of the relationship. So here, when we're talking about the multipolarization or multipolar world, and my understanding is because of political correct, but rather than the reality. Because in any field, no matter you take into the military, or the economy, or technology, or culture, or anything, can we find there are three relatively equal poles in the world? No. So the last comments to your question is that the relationship between Russia and, we heard that, China and Russia, and talking about relationship as an equal partnership is not based on power. It's not because we have equal power. Right? The relationship based on what? We share a common interest. So we work together, we can benefit jointly from our cooperation. I think a previous discussion panel already heard that India, how Indians deal with your neighbors, how you deal with Nepals. And brothers means someone is bigger, someone is small. But if we're talking about the equal partners, there's no sense of who is stronger or who is weaker. So China and the Russia relationship is based on the concept of strategic relation or the strategic benefits rather than the capabilities.
Interesting. Professor Meerschaum, that brings us back to you and to the proposition with which we had begun. If Russia and China are indeed close together, as he says, as a partnership of equals, and we do know that China gets an awful lot of energy from Russia, Russia, in turn, I think, supplies a significant amount of weapons and other things. The Chinese are selling a lot of consumer goods. There's a lot of mutual interdependence that's developed, particularly during the phase of sanctions in the post-Ukraine conflict period. Now, in that particular world, when you speak of a strategic competition between the US and China, are you overlooking the fact that Russia could be a factor in that competition alongside China?
No, not at all. Look, there are three great powers in the system. The United States is the most powerful. China is a close second, and Russia is the weakest of the three great powers. Given that constellation of forces, it is important for the United States to have Russia on its side against China. If you're a great power like the United States, and there's a rising great power like China on the horizon, you need all the help you can get. That means, again, that you want to be allied with the Russians. But we have a situation today where Russia and China, I would argue, are actually close allies, and they're both allied against the United States. This is not in the American strategic interest. Now, the cause of this situation is the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war broke out. The problem started really in 2014. That's when you had this huge crisis where the Russians took the Crimean Peninsula. You all remember that. This was during the unipolar moment. And the end result is that you got poisonous relations between the United States and Russia. And that drove the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. Furthermore, the United States could not fully pivot to Asia. You all remember the famous pivot to Asia? Hillary Clinton announced it in 2011. Hillary said that the United States is going to pivot to Asia. We have been unable, up to this day, to fully pivot to Asia, in good part because we're pinned down in Ukraine. So as a result of the Ukraine war, not only have we driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, number one, but number two, we have been unable to fully pivot to East Asia to deal with the China threat. Now, President Trump, he has tried to fix that situation. As you all know, he has said from the beginning that he is interested in improving relations with Russia. He likes President Putin. And furthermore, he wants to end the Ukraine war. Trump wants to end the Ukraine war because he understands that's the only way we can peel the Russians away from the Chinese. but he has failed to end the Ukraine war. Therefore, the Chinese and the Russians are still on very friendly terms, which is not in our strategic interest. And as I just said to you, there is no sign that President Trump is going to be able to end the conflict in Ukraine in any meaningful way. Therefore, we're not going to be able to fully pivot to East Asia. Therefore, the Russians and the Chinese are going to have a close relationship for the foreseeable future. And this is not in our national interest.
That's fascinating. I'm, to my somewhat great astonishment, seeing signs everywhere telling me time's up. Is time really up? We didn't have even 20 minutes, but if that's the case, all right, then in that case, it's been a rather truncated session. I will say from an Indian point of view, that would have been the last round. If we had time, I would have liked you all to give us your views. Maybe I could ask you for one sentence each, as it were. And if you were advising the Indian Prime Minister as to how to react to this world the three of you have just described, what do you think India should do in this particular global scenario? One sentence each, just as your short, snappy, as President Reagan used to want one-page memos. Give us a one-sentence memo to the Indian Prime Minister. What should India do in this world scenario?
India should float like a butterfly and sting like a bee.
Muhammad Ali, wonderful. Professor Yan.
Well, I think we should realize that we're living in a new world, and AI is a new thing. We have to adjust the foreign policies to the new digital age special characteristic.
Monica.
I would say, hold on, cowboy. It's going to be a really rough ride.
It is going to be a rough ride. Everybody, a warm round of applause for our three professors. Thank you very much.
ABP Ananda, এগিয়ে থাকে, এগিয়ে রাখে।
Thank you.